This video is for The Living Earth, Unit 2.3, Cellular Respiration. Today's essential question: what are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? Our first main idea: aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration refers to the production of ATP using oxygen as a final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Aerobes are organisms that obtain oxygen or absorb oxygen from their environments. These organisms typically produce ATP using aerobic respiration. Some organisms live in oxygen-poor environments or experience circumstances of low oxygen. They would not survive if they required oxygen to produce ATP. Many of these organisms undergo a process similar to aerobic respiration, but they use a different molecule as the final electron acceptor. This process is called anaerobic respiration. Examples of alternative final electron acceptors are sulfate, which is SO4 with a 2- charge, nitrate, which is NO3 with a 1- charge, and sulfur, an S.
Fermentation. Objective: to describe the process of fermentation and its two types. For cellular processes to occur, all living cells require energy. Adenosine triphosphate, often referred to as ATP, is a special molecule which provides energy in a form that can be used for many cellular processes. Fermentation is a metabolic process where ATP can be synthesized in the absence of oxygen. It will occur in two different forms, either in yeast as alcoholic fermentation or in human muscle as lactic acid fermentation. In the presence of oxygen, yeast normally respires through aerobic respiration. But in the oxygen-deficient conditions, yeast is also capable of respiring anaerobically to produce ATP through alcoholic fermentation. Let's look at the process of alcoholic fermentation in yeast. Glycolysis, which is the first stage of cellular respiration, happens normally and will yield 2-pyruvate, 2-NADH, and 2 ATP molecules. During alcoholic fermentation, the pyruvate formed by glycolysis will lose 1 carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, forming acetaldehyde. An alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme will catalyze the reaction between nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NADH, and acetaldehyde. NADH will reduce. In this case, hydrogen will be added to acetaldehyde and will be converted to ethyl alcohol. NADH will be oxidized to NAD+ and will be available for glycolysis. Lactic acid fermentation is similar to alcoholic fermentation, but instead of ethyl alcohol, lactic acid will be produced. This type of fermentation commonly occurs in the muscles. During strenuous exercise, your body won't be able to transport oxygen in the blood quickly enough and will create oxygen-deficient conditions in the muscles. In anaerobic conditions, muscles will partially break down the glucose, convert the pyruvate into lactic acid, and release less energy. During lactic acid fermentation, lactate dehydrogenase enzymes will catalyze the reaction between NADH and pyruvate. NADH will oxidize by releasing 2 hydrogen and electrons that reduce the pyruvate to lactate. Now that the NADH molecules have been converted into NAD+, they can continue the glycolysis reactions and produce some energy. The lactic acid will accumulate in the muscles, triggering cramps and fatigue, which serve as an indication you need to stop exercising. Continuing to breathe deeply and rapidly after exercising is a way of supplying the body with the oxygen required to break the accumulated lactic acid into carbon dioxide and water. Summary: fermentation is a metabolic process by which energy is released from food molecules in the absence of oxygen. Fermentation occurs in two different forms: in yeast as alcoholic fermentation, and in human muscles as lactic acid fermentation. The process of fermentation is meant to oxidize NADH accumulated through glycolysis into NAD+ for the continuation of glycolysis, which yields some ATP.
Every living organism, both plant and animal, needs energy to live. Organisms get this energy from food. Unlike plants that make their own food through photosynthesis, animals have to consume other organisms for food. Energy is stored as chemical potential energy in the foods that we eat. Both plants and animals undergo anaerobic and aerobic respiration to release energy from simple sugar molecules like glucose. This energy is converted into a high-energy molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, that can be readily used in many cellular processes. Glycolysis is the first step of cellular respiration and is anaerobic, meaning it does not require oxygen, whereas the other steps of cellular respiration are aerobic, processes that do require oxygen. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell and produces ATP and NADH. Both these molecules act a bit like rechargeable batteries that can store energy and release energy when and where the cell needs it. During glycolysis, two ATP molecules are first used to break one glucose molecule in half to form two pyruvate molecules, 4 ATP molecules, and 2 molecules of energy carrying NADH. Since 2 ATP molecules were used to make the final 4 ATP molecules, glycolysis only produces a net of 2 new ATP molecules from 1 molecule of glucose. This is not a very efficient process, and most of the chemical potential energy in the original glucose molecule is not released. In the absence of oxygen, a process called fermentation converts the pyruvate from glycolysis into other substances. In some organisms, like yeast for example, fermentation also produces the alcohol ethanol. This process of alcoholic fermentation is used in brewing. In animal cells, fermentation creates lactic acid and causes a burning sensation in active muscles, a signal that not enough oxygen is present to sustain the muscle cells. If these muscle cells are exposed to oxygen, they will complete glycolysis and move to the aerobic steps of cellular respiration, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, where an additional 29 to 36 molecules of ATP can be made.
At this point, you should be able to generate a full and complete response to today's essential question. What are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration?